Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is a video focusing, inshallah, on the Edexcel Poetry Anthology question. The exam's coming up soon. So really, the way I'm looking at it is it's only going to be like a taster, just kind of getting our heads around that paper. In terms of a more fuller how to answer the question, that is something that I can do a video later. To start us off, just sharing it here. All right, so I'm just starting the share. Okay, so this is, as I say, the anthology poetry booster, and focusing specifically on the conflict set of poems. Now, as such, the question is divided into a section A and a section B, and because we're focusing on the anthology, this will be the section A. Slightly different to the last two videos. Here we have to compare the two poems. One poem, they will let you know, present the poem in front of you. You have the poem, obviously unannotated. Which poem will be one of the 15, and you have to compare with one of your choice, obviously one from the 15. In terms of references, you should use quotations, but if you can't remember, you may paraphrase. Obviously, paraphrasing is not as significant in terms of marking is concerned, and you'll find yourself potentially waffling. And if not waffling, then at least finding a lot of sentences just to explain something quite straightforward. Therefore, quotations are a bit more punchier and to the point, and more substantial. The last thing to mention, unlike the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, you don't forget that you do need to mention context for the two poems. So that is something that is you can't remember, you can't forget to do that. Okay, so moving on. When you're looking into this whole discussion of brainstorming, what you should discuss, remember the timing. You would have 35 minutes on this section. Well, that means you'll have two major paragraphs. Have you noticed there's a kind of pattern here? So we call these mini essays. Again, you'd want somewhere between 3 and 6 quotes per paragraph. The more the better. 1 or 2 quotes, not good. So yeah, as I say, 3 to 6 quotes or more. So yeah, think it through. You do the maths. Okay, 2 paragraphs. You know, really about 12 quotes thereabouts maximum. When I say maximum, I mean aiming as a high number. The more, the better. So what is the approach? Well, what questions have come up previously? Well, you have, you look up on, I've looked at the sample assessment material, the sample paper, and all the exam papers from 2017 to 2022. And the poems that came up for the sample assessment paper was Catherine, and the anthology theme that was connected to that poem was tension. Discuss the theme of tension. Sample paper 1, it was half-cast that came up, and it was about identity. Ideas about identity was the question on that theme. Sample paper 2, what were they like, was a poem that came up, and the theme was memories. Now, the first GCSE exam paper that was sat, 2017, Belfast, I should say confetti came up, and it was the experience of conflict. 2018, it was Poison Tree and anger came up. 2019, War Photographer, and the theme about images came up. Very sort of unusual one then. 2020, the poem Poppies was the poem that came up, and the question was around conflict that affects people. Okay. Now, notice 2020, conflict affects people, and 2017, the experience of conflict. So, in a way, conflict has come up twice. Okay. Now, 2021, you have exposure that came up, and the topic was on war. And last year, 2022, the poem that came up was no problem, and the theme was the idea of a problem. Okay. Now, let's think this through. What possible topics does that leave? So, what I've done is I've run through all of the poems. You've got Poison Tree. The question that came up was anger, as we mentioned, but the potential themes you could have mentioned connected to this poem: conflict, nature, planning, the idea of a plan, having a plan, repression, arrogance, justice. Destruction of Sennacherib, you did not come up. You could potentially talk about war, conflict, nature, arrogance, justice, and loss. Extract from a prelude has not come up. Potential themes: fear, conflict, nature, relationships, and learning. Man he killed has not come up. Potential themes: war, conflict, relationships, class, culture. This is just brainstorming certain themes that could come up. Cousin Kate has not come up. The potential themes: conflict, arrogance, relationships, class, love, women, justice, and loss. Half caste has come up. We mentioned about identity, but other potential themes: conflict, prejudice, relationships, arrogance, culture, communication, and learning. Exposure, obviously, this is about war, and other themes you could have mentioned is conflict, fear, religion, hope, nature, relationships, and loss. In terms of the charge of the Light Brigade, it has not come up. Potential themes: war, class, plan, failure, hope, religion, fear, and loss. We've also got Catherine that has come up with tension. Potential themes: conflict, family, relationships, communication, and hope. War photographer has already come up, and it was about images. Other themes: conflict, war, fear, hope, women, and loss. Belfast Confetti anthology question that came up: experience of conflict. Potential themes: war, conflict, fear, communication, culture, and hope. The class game has not come up. Potential themes: conflict, class, prejudice, relationships, arrogance, culture, and learning. Office has come up: conflict that affects people. Potential themes: war, conflict, family, fear, relationships, women, and loss. No problem has come up, as I say, last year with the theme of problem. Other things could be mentioned is conflict, prejudice, relationships, arrogance, culture, communication, and learning. Finally, what were they like has come up with the theme of memories. Potential other themes: conflict, war, relationships, nature, family, arrogance, culture, communication, and loss. So what that means, if you look at the poem, the poems that are remaining, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These 6 poems have not yet come up out of the 15. Destruction of Sennacherib, Prelude, that's the extract from the Prelude, Man He Killed, Cousin Kate, Charge of the Light Brigade, and the Class Game. Now, my personal feeling, and I can be wrong because I was wrong last year, I feel Prelude will come up, but I have no knowledge. This is just my feeling. But there is some interesting kind of thing I can show you in a minute. And you can see here all the potential themes. Now, if you look across the potential themes, conflict is in all, technically it should be in all of them. War is destruction of Sennacherib and Man He Killed, and charge of the Light Brigade. We have prejudice in the class game. Cousin Kate is about loss, maybe love, relationships. But then you can also talk about relationships in the class game, Man He Killed, and Prelude. So these are things to think about in terms of what topics to focus in on when you're doing your revision. What about themes? What themes have come up? So the ones in bold on the left are the ones that have come up. So you've got tension, identity, memories, conflict, experience, anger, images, conflict people, but they're both conflict, war, and problem. So these are all the themes that come up. So of the themes I've just mentioned in the previous slide, what's remaining? You have nature, planning, repression, arrogance, justice, loss, fear, relationships, learning, class, culture, love, women, prejudice, family, and communication. So what do we do now? So if we look at the grouping according to the themes, if we were to break these themes down, try and put them into some kind of groups, you have poems to do with conflict. So you have tension, conflict experience, conflict people, problem, and war are all on the left. Notice they are in bold, which means that they've already come up. So the idea of conflict or specific mention of conflict is possible because conflict, the conflict experience, conflict people has come up. But just so you know, those kinds of like a poem which has war and the question is going to be about war is more and more unlikely. What about principles or concepts? So identity and images has come up, but you could get the theme of justice coming up, or learning, culture, planning, and nature. How about topic of people? So you have the idea of relationships and family and women. That's another kind of category. What about prejudice, where you have the theme of racism and the theme of class or classism? And finally, you have human traits. So you have memories and anger that's already come up, but other possible human traits that could become a theme is repression or love or loss or arrogance or fear or communication. So the trick, I think, what you should do is focus on conflict. Now you might think, wait, you've already said, sir, conflict, it's already come up twice. The reason why you should focus on conflict and ensure that on a minimum level you are able to talk about conflict for every single poem is this anthology is all about conflict. It's called the Conflict Anthology. So whatever topic comes up, they will all have something conflictual about them. So what you would do is you'd do a brainstorm. I would suggest starting with those remaining poems, right? And then you'd have a beginning, pick at least one quote initially for the beginning, which is the most significant quote to do with the beginning of the poem, to do with conflict. Where is the conflict in the beginning of that poem, of the remaining poems? And then one quote about the middle. Give me one quote about the middle of the poem. Okay. And then the ending. Give me one significant quote about the ending of the poem to do with conflict. Where is the conflict at the end? Okay, or what can you say about conflict at the end? Now, that only gives you 3 quotes. And we mentioned you're supposed to do 3 quotes per paragraph. But remember, this is for one poem. You still have the other poem, remember? Because you have to compare. So if you have the other poem, that means you would have a total, if you just did one quote, of 6 quotes. And if I remember correctly, each paragraph was supposed to have somewhere between 3 to 6 quotes per paragraph. So this would get you 6 quotes. So now if you were to get 2 quotes for the beginning, the middle, and the end, you have 6 quotes for one poem. And then for the other poem, you would have 6 as well. So that's your total of 12. So did you see the 2 paragraphs you were supposed to have about 3 to 6 quotes? So if you now have, imagine you did 6, and for your second paragraph you did 6, that's 12. And if you just have 2 quotes from the beginning, middle, end of every poem, you would manage to sustain those the quotes that we were suggesting you try to have. So what's the last thing here? The bottom right hand corner is about context. Because remember, you're supposed to mention context. And what I would do is I'd divide that into two halves, because you should try to have mention context at least a couple of times. By the way, this is all minimum. So, so in terms of the beginning, write down your quotes. In terms of the middle, in terms of the ending, and finally your context. Just 2 points about the context. What I would suggest is you talk about context near the beginning and context nearer the end. And I think that would probably be it. So this is supposed to be a brief, just quick overview, looking at what's possibly going to be coming up and looking at an initial approach of how to deal with conflict poems. I would suggest targeting those poems that have not come up. It does not mean you ignore the poems that have come up, because you don't know, they may come up again. It's just the odds are less likely. Has a poem turned up more than once? The answer is no. Okay, not only since not from 2017 onwards, it has not. They have not repeated a poem. And if you look at the sample assessment material and the sample papers, they have not used those as of yet. Okay, but this year could be different. So I hope this something useful that you can take from this. Last point I wanted to ask is, if you wanted me to focus on a specific poem going forward, then do let me know. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.